coming out tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about Angular 2, which we've picked the perfect time to have this meetup because Angular 2 has gone release candidate this week. So it's been in beta for a while and it's now finally out there, ready for use. So let's get right into it. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ron Heft and I'm the co-founder and CTO of the Social Station. And at the Social Station, we build technology solutions that enable service-based businesses to connect with their customers online. We have several technology pieces that we use. We have an internal application and a client-facing application, and both of our front-end applications are using Angular. So I've been developing with Angular now for about 2 to 3 years. Previously, I was using Backbone.js as my framework of choice, but I've switched over to Angular, and that's what I've been using for all my projects as of late. And before I forget, if you have any questions following the presentation, feel free to reach out to me at ronaldheft.com. You'll find my socials on there, email. So if you have any questions or anything you think of after the presentation, that's where you can reach out, and also have the slides available online afterwards. So what is Angular? So Angular is an open source web application framework. Open source meaning it's essentially free. It's community driven. So anyone can contribute to the project. Anyone can suggest ideas. Anyone can fix bugs. It's completely open source, available for everyone to use. It's been around since 2010. And since 2010, Google has heavily adopted Angular internally. It started out just as regular open source, but Google really enjoyed using it on their own projects. And now the majority of the contributions to the Angular project is coming from Google. Google's providing project management support. They're doing a lot of development on the framework, and they're fixing bugs and really kind of organizing the community. And Angular 2 has largely been driven by Google. They've really taken up the lead on pushing forward on the Angular 2 development, and they are using it on pretty much everything going forward that they're releasing from Google on a front-end piece is going to be using Angular 2. They've already updated some of their applications, like AdWords was a recent one that they just released using Angular 2. So you're going to start seeing a lot more Google projects using Angular 2. And the big differentiator that I see from Angular from other open source web application frameworks is the main goal of Angular is to really be like the Swiss Army knife of web application frameworks. So I see really the goal of the Angular project, any need that you have as a front-end developer, Angular is looking to solve. So it's looking to provide all the basics of doing templating, routing, animations, and data loading. And where it doesn't provide things right out of the box, it's looking to set the design patterns and provide the extensibility to make doing whatever you want to do on your web application as easy as possible. And because of that, a large development community has sprung up around Angular. So with Angular 1, there's currently 1,800 published modules on ngmodules.org. I think that number is actually pretty low. There seems to be way more out there floating around on GitHub, various package managers like Bower and NPM. And when it comes to Angular, pretty much if you have some common thing that you're doing in your application, if you search for a module first, you can usually find something that's doing data validation or some UI component that you need. There's almost always a module for it. And when there isn't, Angular is highly extensible so that you can write your own code to do your specific logic or build like a shim around something else that you found, like a regular JavaScript project or a jQuery plugin. Some of the competitors you may hear about in terms of Angular are React.js, which is heavily embracing the component side of things, and it's not really looking to be the kind of Swiss Army knife. And that came out of Facebook. Backbone.js, which is a little bit older than Angular, that came out of New York Times. Ember.js, that came out of Apple, and Knockout.js, which came out of Microsoft. So those are some of the other kind of big web application frameworks that you might here being talked about. So specifically tonight, we're going to be talking about Angular 2. And Angular 2 has been a huge effort from within the Angular community because it's been a complete rewrite from scratch. So the Angular team has been working on this now for well over a year. It's been in planning for a while. They've had about 6 months worth of beta releases. And as I said at the start of this presentation, we lucked out. This is perfect timing wise because Angular has exited beta this week, is now release candidate 1, just in time for this weekend's actually the big Angular conference and gconf. So they got that out there. And according to Google, everything is now production ready. So there's various bits and pieces of Angular 2, like other side kind of spin-offs that didn't quite make the release date, but the core product of Angular is now ready and able to be used in any production project. So being a complete rewrite of Angular 1, you have to have really a good reason to go back to the drawing board and start fresh. So objectively, the goals around Angular 2, number 1, is to be easier to learn. So Angular 1 kind of sprung up around, it started out as a kind of a small project and quickly with the goal of trying to address all needs of web applications, ended up becoming bloated pretty quickly. So lots of features were added throughout the years, and sometimes multiple versions of the same feature were added with different ways to do the same thing. So it became a little bit confusing as a new developer to Angular as far as what's the best approach to doing something. So Angular 2 is looking to do a reset on that, remove some of the bloat, make things a lot cleaner. Another big goal of the Angular 2 project is to be faster. So Angular 1 is pretty performant out of the box, but can quickly really slow down. It's really easy as a developer, if you're not aware of the logic behind how Angular works, to build a really beefy application that runs really slowly on mobile or on a slow desktop machine. So the Angular 2 project, goals with that is to kind of remove some of that burden from the developers, solve some of the patterns that could lead developers down a path that would make their code run really slowly, and overall just speed up Angular wherever possible. So that's been a big focus of the Angular 2 release. Unofficially, from what I've basically seen throughout the various projects around Angular 2, I really get the sense that the Angular 2 team is looking to be a lot more opinionated. As I said, Angular 1 had a lot of different options for doing things just right out of the box. And then there was a lot of things too that the Angular team didn't want to touch because there was a whole bunch of third-party modules out there that kind of met those needs. And really the Angular 2 team kind of sat down and said, all right, this is the best approach to doing this. These are the best modules that developers are using, and look to bring all of that into Angular 2 and provide one option and what they felt is the best option for doing that particular task within Angular 2. So a lot more first-party options in Angular 2. There's also now around being opinionated, there is an official style guide. So that's something the Angular team didn't originally want to touch. And there was an unofficial style guide in Angular 1. And now in Angular 2, there's an official style guide. So as a style guide, that's awesome for developers because it provides a common way of how your code should be formatted so that hopefully if the entire Angular development team embraces this style guide, as you kind of move from project to project, you see different examples online. Code should look very familiar and you'll see common trends on how things are done. So let's get into it now. So being a complete rewrite from scratch, this gave the Angular 2 team an option to change up how they're essentially the language itself. So Angular 2 has standardized around TypeScript. So the entire Angular 2 team has done the development in TypeScript. And TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. So JavaScript, ES5 or ES6, which is the current version in all browsers. TypeScript, a superset of it, provides a lot of convenience functions for developers. So you have annotations in TypeScript. It is also, by the name of being TypeScript, type safe. So it makes refactoring a lot easier, dealing around variables. And being a superset of JavaScript, all existing JavaScript code works fine in TypeScript. It's just a set of convenience functions throughout TypeScript, which are then implemented as a build step and compiled into plain JavaScript during build, because browsers don't understand TypeScript natively. You have to take the TypeScript code and convert it to regular JavaScript. So Angular 2 itself has been developed in TypeScript, and pretty much the community is standardizing around it. So there's a lot of convenience, especially with the annotations, in using TypeScript. The Angular 2 team has given the option that you can use plain JavaScript if you want. So they have their documentation in plain JavaScript, and they also have the documentation using Google Dart. But I find it really interesting that Angular 2 team actually went with TypeScript, which is Microsoft's extension from JavaScript, versus Google Dart, which is Google's own. So they've kind of might be doing a little writing on the wall for Google Dart. But so Angular 2's TypeScript, you're going to see, if you look into any examples online, pretty much Angular 2 developers are standardizing on it, but you can use regular JavaScript if you would like. Next big change in Angular 2 is the moving from directives to components. So you need a little bit of kind of history on how directives came to be in Angular 1. So when Angular 1 started, there was really no true concept of components. It was, or at least it just wasn't as popular as it is today. React.js has really made components extremely popular in front-end development. So originally Angular just had a traditional controller type architecture where you could, off of an HTML tag, specify what controller matches up and specify then your templating code within it. Well, along the development of Angular 1, they added the concept of directives. And directives essentially allowed you to bind to any arbitrary set of HTML. So you could bind to a root HTML tag, which is just like a component works in any component architecture. But you could also do other things, like you could bind to a property. So you could bind to example in that div right there. Even more interestingly, you could bind to a class, which I never really found a valid use case for. It seemed kind of a really weird use to trigger logic off of a CSS class. But essentially, it was very flexible. You could bind to any arbitrary set of HTML, which, while powerful, became very messy in practice, because you could have that third example right there of example class of special property, passing in value, action method call. There's no real clear path as to where the code goes. There could be 4 different directives running off of that set of HTML. There could be one set of directives. There could be one directive interpreting it all, or technically there could be nothing linked to that. So as a developer, when you're looking at your HTML in Angular 1, it could become confusing. If you weren't doing a good job of organizing your code, you had some struggles of trying to figure out where your directives are and what was actually being triggered from things. So Angular 2 being component-based now, which the component architecture is essentially your view logic is driving everything, like you're defining the set of code to run from your view. That is a lot more clear now. So the only thing that would be binded in the last example there of Angular 2 is the example tag, the root HTML tag. And then all the other properties go with the example component. So when you're looking to make sense of your code, you know immediately to look to the example component. And Angular even takes it a step further in Angular 2 by adding a little bit of interesting syntax around the actual property passing. So you have the property with the brackets, which indicates a property binding. And then you have the parentheses, which is indicating an event binding. So it's looking to make things a lot more clear so that you can see how the component is interpreting the HTML. And interestingly, both the brackets and the parentheses are actually valid HTML. So next up, in terms of features for Angular 2, the HTTP module, which is going to be big for any development that needs to connect up to a backend. So in Angular 1 made a huge leap, I feel, in frameworks by adding promises. So if anyone's not familiar with a promise, it's by nature making network calls, it's asynchronous. So you make the call, it could come back at any time, and then when it comes back, you want to trigger off some logic. So you would traditionally in regular JavaScript and in things like jQuery, you would run a callback after that. Well, as applications became more advanced, more complex, it got really tricky to keep track of all your callbacks. So Angular 1 added promises, and you'll see this in a lot of asynchronous programming languages. And promises are a set of convenience methods around doing asynchronous code. So you can easily chain asynchronous logic off of one another. You can do things like grouping, like have a whole bunch of asynchronous calls, and then once all of those calls return, you can trigger a new set of logic. So that was a huge enhancement in Angular 1. Angular 2 is taking it a step further by implementing observables, which are essentially promises on steroids. So they have a lot more convenience methods available to developers. One of them being retry. So if you have an asynchronous call that fails for whatever reason, you can specify the observable as retryable and it will automatically retry it. You can do intervals, which is really helpful for if you have a piece of data that needs to be pulled and updated constantly in your application. So you can specify update this every 15 seconds, update this every 30 seconds, whatever interval you have. And last but not least, which I think is really cool, it brings the concept of subscribe and unsubscribe to promises. And where this becomes in handy is if you have a situation where the call you made is no longer relevant and you don't care about that data. This might commonly come up in you're implementing a search and you have a search box with terms and a user types in terms into a search box. You make a backend service call. The backend service call takes a little bit to return. The user starts typing again. It makes a second call with their updated term. Well, by the nature of calls being asynchronous, those calls could arrive out of order and you could easily end up with the first call arriving second and making your view state out of sync from what the user actually typed in their terms. So by using observables and subscribe, unsubscribe, it's looking to address that issue. By the second the user starts typing in a new term, you can invalidate and unsubscribe from that previous call. So it will never affect your view state. You only care about the latest version of that asynchronous call you have out there. So very handy convenience functions for doing any type of asynchronous code. Routing has also taken a huge step up in Angular 2. So routing is important in single-page web applications because what a router does is it takes the URL in the browser and determines the set of templates and code that should be displayed to the user. It makes one page function as many. So in Angular 1, it had a router out of the box, very, very basic. Didn't really support nested complex state. So if you have a hierarchy that goes several pages down, it didn't work very well. So pretty much all developers, if you're starting any complex project, you pulled in a third-party module called UI Router, which the whole Angular 2 community kind of standardized around. It was very helpful, solved a lot of those problems of complex nested states, but it was also very confusing. There's a lot of power in it. And as a new developer to Angular and using UI Router, it took a little bit to wrap your head around and understand how it worked because it was just very powerful. It also had tended to cause developers to make all of their route files or all of their routing in one file, which could be really confusing. So you could be defining every single URL in one file and that file could quickly become bloated and hard to understand and link up with what code goes with each different route. So the goals of the Angular 2 team was to take that power of UI router and bring it into Angular 2, but also make it as simple as possible. So I think the Angular 2 team nailed it by using annotations. So off of components, you can annotate at route config and have all of your configuration with your routes live with your individual components. The syntax is really straightforward. You're just specifying a path. You can specify some variables such as a name that would go with, you could have it replace the title bar or some breadcrumb in your interface. And then you specify the component that goes with that route. And it's nested and hierarchical. So if you have a subcomponent being used in a component, you can also define a route config off of that as well. So right out of the box, it handles all of that nesting. And there's lots of convenience components that come with it, such as router outlet, which is essentially where the view gets dumped when a route is active. So a lot of the complexity of UI router and the power has been brought into Angular 2. Animations. So this actually did not make the cut, unfortunately, for the Angular 2 release candidate, but this is still coming in the near future. So Angular 1 added some support for making animations a lot easier as a developer to use. So as a template is rendered in Angular and new elements get rendered on the page, Angular 1 adds convenient CSS classes like ng-show, ng-hide. And as a developer, you can write CSS animations off of those that trigger animation logic. Well, in Angular 1, if you're not doing a very good job of organizing your code, that could get kind of messy. All of your animations start living in the same CSS files as your presentation, and you can quickly lose track of where animations are triggered. So Angular 2 is looking to bring the power of annotations to animations by specifying JSON files that drive the animation logic. So you could have a animations.json file, and in it specify which component and the animation state that drives off of that. So ng-enter would say off my component, as that component is drawn on the page, run a fade animation, a slide animation, rotate, explode. And those various different animations are defined in a separate file of common. So you can define common animations through CSS. And then what ends up happening is on compile of your application, a CSS file gets generated with all of your animation code from it. So your animations are defined simply in a JSON file, and then all the CSS is generated for you. You're not redefining the same animations over and over again in your different CSS files. You're defining them essentially as a function and calling that function wherever you want to use that particular animation. As I mentioned, this didn't quite make the release. It's still proposed, might make it into the final release before everything's said and done. But currently, the existing ng-enter, ng-hide from Angular 1 is still valid in Angular 2. Next up, speed. So as I mentioned, a big goal of Angular 2 was to dramatically improve the speed of Angular. So as I mentioned, Angular 1 had a little bit of a reputation of being slow. And that was from two different things. So first off, the templating was all driven by the document object model. And anyone who has been a front-end developer for a while knows there's a lot of painful legacy stuff built into the document object model. It's slow. A lot of browsers in the past implemented it poorly, had lots of different bugs. So it was painful to drive templating off the document object model. The other big slowdown that could occur in Angular 1 is the digest cycle. And the digest cycle is the magic behind how Angular actually works. So in your template files, you specify variables. And the way Angular keeps those variables up to date is it essentially sets a listener on every single variable you put on the page. And then when any event on the page occurs that could potentially affect the view state, it runs through a massive for loop of every single thing that's on your page and checking to see if it's affected by what just changed in your view state. If you have a few things on the page, it's not so bad. If you have a really complicated application, you can quickly end up with thousands and thousands of things in your view state. And your view state could be updated quite frequently. Digest cycles, if you're not careful, when you're trying to do all types of cool animations and things like that, you might be triggering things on hover of different elements or mouse movements. And anytime you set up something like that in Angular, it has to run the digest cycle over and over and over again. So it's not uncommon for on an Angular 1 application for the digest cycle to run thousands of times in over a course of a minute or so. On mobile, that became very painful, and limited CPU, limited memory, everything slowed down. So Angular 2 is looking to do a reset on that. So the first way it's doing that is by one-way binding. So when you're putting a variable on the page, it doesn't need to be monitored after it's on the page. Most of the time, anything you put on there, like let's say you're logging into an application, you put the user's name up at the top right. That doesn't need to be updated again until a new user logs in. So Angular 2 has introduced the concept of one-way binding. Once it's on the page, it's there until you manually say, hey, this needs to be updated. Well, manually saying that can be a bit of a pain. So actually what Angular 2 has done is pre-built that into the syntax. Earlier, when I showed you those brackets and the parentheses around the component tags, those are actually behind the scenes telling Angular what you're doing with that variable. So the very nature of how the templating works, you will be defining out how often it needs to be updated. So if it's just a regular bracket, it can be one-way binded. If it's something that needs to be live updated, you use the brackets and then also the parentheses around it, and that denotes to Angular that, hey, this needs to be updated every time. So they've kind of driven the speed into the actual templating, so as a developer, you don't have to think about it so much. Next thing they've done in terms of speed, they've introduced lazy module loading. So with a single page application, you might have 10 pages that are part of your core application. Well, a user may only go to the first 2 pages. Those 8 other pages they never went to, got loaded into the browser, and was just kind of wasted bandwidth, wasted download time for something that they never even saw. So by doing lazy module loading, when you go to, basically the code is only requested when it's needed. So those other pages, those 8 other pages that the user never made it to, those modules will not be loaded until they need it. Next up, as I mentioned, document object model was a pain point in Angular 1. So in Angular 2, rendering of the templating is now completely disconnected from the document object model. They built their own rendering engine. And this is really, really cool. So what this means is now essentially Angular is not dependent on a browser. So the first cool thing that the Angular team has done is come up with a project called Angular Universal. And the idea behind Angular Universal is to make an application even faster by doing the initial render of the page on the server side. So if a single page application, as I mentioned, the way it traditionally works, a whole page, your whole application comes down, gets loaded up, the browser interprets the code, interprets the templates, then it figures out what data needs to be on the page. You make the application in the browser, makes the calls to your backend service, loads the data. Well, with Angular Universal, the idea is you have a backend server rather, that you go to the page and it gets rendered on the server. and the server sends the pre-compiled version of the page to the browser, just like a traditional web application like you used to implement before, before frameworks like Angular. So all the code is already interpreted. But then it takes a step from there and sends the full application code as well, and seamlessly transitions from serving up the page directly to being a single page application. So that when you go to the next page in the browser, it's just requesting your backend service data and not actually making a call back to the server and doing all the rendering. So that's a really cool implementation of using the render outside of the browser. Also, I think it's really helpful for Google because with a traditional single page application framework, like I said, your template code is not compiled when you're downloading it. So as a crawler for like search, traditionally you see template code that's not compiled, and the crawler has to then implement the browser directly and try to figure out what the page actually looks like because it's seeing your raw template files. So by serving up the pre-compiled version using Angular Universal, Google Search can index the page much easier. So the other cool thing about the renderer being disconnected from the document object model is around the project Ionic. So Ionic formed around the Angular 1 project, and the goal was to be able to do native mobile development using Angular. So you could, write the code, the syntax you're familiar with using JavaScript, using HTML, and implement it as a native app. You would have plugins that you could interface with hardware features on phones and simplify the whole process. It was really cool in terms of being able to essentially build full native applications, but it also had slowdown issues because the applications were still implemented in the browser. It's using the phone's browser, which depending on how efficient your code is can be really, really slow with big view states and whatnot. So now in Angular 2, with the renderer being disconnected from the document object model, the Ionic 2 project is looking to actually completely separate Ionic from the browser. So your applications that you build in Angular 2 can be implemented as a 100% native app. Google's working on a native renderer for Objective-C and Java so that your web application code is really 100% a native app. It gets the full speed of using the native programming language on each mobile device platform. So this is going to be a huge thing when it comes to making cross-platform apps and keeping everything nice and fast. The Ionic 2 project is highly in alpha right now, so they've just kind of announced it in the past couple of weeks, but they're really forming a good team around it, and I think within the next 6 months or so, there's going to be some really cool options for developing native applications in Angular 2. Last but not least, in terms of speed, Angular 2 is leveraging web workers now. So traditionally, JavaScript in the browser is single-threaded. Can be very slow. If you have any complex back-end processing tasks, being single-threaded, you're constantly switching back and forth between doing your processing and making sure your view is performant and staying up to date. Web workers have come out in browsers, in modern browsers over the past couple of years, and they're essentially a way to implement threads in the browser. Angular 2 is taking advantage of web workers in terms of the rendering engine, but it also has an awesome API now for your own code to implement in web worker threads, which is going to just make web applications feel a lot faster in the browser. And last but not least, in terms of cool things in Angular 2, there is now an official command line interface for Angular 2. So traditionally, when you're starting off a project, you're pulling in tools such as Grunt and Gulp to do your build automation, and you're pulling in something like Yeoman to do your scaffolding and setting up your project. And The Angular team is looking to address all of that by having their own official command line interface, which does all the build stuff. It will compile TypeScript. It will compile your CSS from Sass or less down to regular CSS. It will serve up your page during development, minify things, you do everything that you traditionally do, and then also provide the scaffolding so that you could say, generate a service and it will generate the service file in your project. And the nice thing about the official command line interface, it's using the official style guide. So all the code is complying with that style guide. In addition to the command line interface, there is now also official IDE support. So Google's been working closely with JetBrains on a number of different things. Android has standardized around IntelliJ as the official IDE, and Google is looking to do the same thing with Angular and JetBrains with WebStorm. So the WebStorm IDE is now Angular 2 aware. So it knows how the code works, how it all functions, which makes things like refactoring easy, makes code completion really easy. So there's a lot of powerful support within the WebStorm IDE. So if you're excited about all the things I've talked about so far in Angular 2 and you have an existing Angular 1 application, being a complete rewrite from Angular 1, there is a little bit of steps to migrating, and the Angular 2 team is aware this can be a little bit painful. So they've come up with a couple of options for migrating your Angular 1 application to Angular 2. The first being ng forward. So the idea behind ng forward is you can write an Angular 1 application using Angular 2 syntax. So everything how Angular 2 defines out the syntax, and then it just gets compiled and run as Angular 1. So you can update things slowly, service by service, file by file, and it's implemented as a build step. So there's no major overhead. The browser is not having to do any extra work. Just during your build, all the Angular 2 syntax is converted back to Angular 1. It's an interesting approach. There's some disadvantages to it, though. So not all Angular 2 features and syntax are supported because it's not Angular 2. You're just writing Angular 2 code, syntax, and having it compile to Angular 1. So you don't get to really take advantage of any of the new features of Angular 2 until you're ready to migrate. And I think this has a potential big drawback of if you're updating all your files slowly, it's almost like you're developing in the dark, where you don't really know if the files that you converted to Angular 2 are actually going to work in Angular 2 until you do that final migration. And if you migrated a lot of files, you may find things aren't working, and it might be something that you migrated a long time ago, and it becomes a painful hunt to figure out what isn't working. So it's an interesting approach. It's a good option, but there's other ones too. So the other option the Angular 2 team has come up with is ng upgrade. So this differs from ng forward, and this is Angular 1 and Angular 2 living side by side in the same application. So what you can do is you can upgrade Angular 1 services for use in Angular 2, and you can take Angular 2 services and downgrade them for Angular 1. So as you're developing your application, you can start writing your stuff in Angular 2. If you need to pull in some code, a service that you previously wrote, you can upgrade it into Angular 2. Now you have that new service in Angular 2. You have to do an enhancement to something in your Angular 1 code. You can downgrade that Angular 2 service back to Angular 1. It's an interesting approach to being able to do the migration. So you can upgrade service by service, module by module, and take advantage of the Angular 2 features immediately. This also has a huge advantage in the fact of all those modules that are out there for Angular 1 can still be used in Angular 2. You can take something that hasn't been updated for Angular 2 already, pull it in, and then run it through the upgrade process and have an Angular 1 module available in your Angular 2 code. Very handy. Has some disadvantages, though. All the stuff I was talking about at speed, well, you're going to forget about it because you're running two versions of Angular side by side. So any overhead that you had in Angular 1 is even worse because you're running two versions of Angular. So there's going to be some slowdown there. You're also not all features of Angular 2 are supported when doing the downgrading. So you might run into some scenarios where you're using something new that you wrote in Angular 2 and it just doesn't downgrade back down to Angular 1. So you might be forced to update some of your modules sooner rather than later. So it's, interesting drawbacks, but I think it's a really interesting approach to handling the upgrade process. So conclusions. First off, what's happening with Angular 1? So this is a major upgrade in terms of just everything. Rewrite, syntax is different, lots of changes. So the Angular 2 team understands that Angular community is going to be scared about this, like being forced to kind of upgrade your application. So they're not forcing anyone to upgrade application. As of right now, there is no end of life announcement for Angular 1. They are continuing Angular 1 development for quite some time. They've just released Angular 1.5 and Angular 1.6 is on the roadmap. So it's going to be, Angular 1 is going to be trucking for quite some time. And in fact, which makes things kind of confusing, they're actually taking some Angular 2 features and backporting them to Angular 1. The idea is it's supposed to make it easier for developers to then upgrade to Angular 2. But I think it also makes things a little bit confusing because all the kind of cool new features are also coming back to Angular 1. So why upgrade? But if you have an Angular 1 application, you don't have to worry about rushing out and updating it right away. So existing Angular projects, you're safe staying on Angular 1, and it's probably not worth it if you have a huge application to upgrade because there's so many developers out there using Angular 1 that the community is going to be supported for quite some time. If you have a small application that maybe you haven't done a ton of development on yet, but you see yourself using that application well into the future, it's probably worthwhile looking at upgrading to Angular 2 because the Angular 2 community is definitely embracing it. A lot of the third-party modules have already started on upgrading to Angular 2. The community is excited behind it. So I think the whole concept of there not being an end of life to Angular 1 is something that is just a temporary measure. Right now, while we go through this kind of beta release candidate phase, Google doesn't want to scare anyone that Angular is not a safe platform to develop with. But I think give it 3-6 months from now and you have some substantial projects running on Angular 2, I think there will be some kind of end of life for Angular 1. So it will probably be worthwhile if you're going to be developing an application for quite some time to switch to Angular 2. So if you're starting something brand new today, in the next few weeks, going production ready, it's 100% safe to start using Angular 2 today. If there's modules that you want to use from Angular 1, you can use ng upgrade to get them working in Angular 2 and take advantage of all those cool new features. So last but not least, am I upgrading the applications that I have out there right now in Angular 1? No. I'm really excited for Angular 2, but I'm kind of on the lines of it's going to be a major process to upgrade. There's a lot of cool features, but a lot of the features that are in Angular 2 can still be done in Angular 1. A lot of it's just convenience things. Speed's a big part of Angular 2, but if you're aware of the pitfalls of Angular 1, you can kind of work around some of those performance issues. You're not going to get a native implemented renderer, but you can at least make things work well in the browser. There is one small set of applications that I have that if there's a lot more development going on it, I'm not quite sure yet, that when I would get into developing it, I would probably upgrade to Angular 2. And I'm definitely looking forward to having a project to start fresh with something on Angular 2. But right now, I don't have anything of that in my roadmap. So I have some resources here for anyone who's interested in learning more about Angular 2. There's the official documentation, the style guide, which is great for any new developer to kind of get familiar with how things are done in an Angular way. There's a TypeScript quick start. So if you haven't used TypeScript before in the past, it's a great tutorial for getting familiar with it. And of particular interest to everyone here is the ng Lightning module. So ng Lightning is a bridge essentially between Lightning and Angular. And it has just in the past 2 weeks been updated for Angular 2. And there's a lot of really handy connections between Lightning and convenience functions in it for Salesforce in general. So if you're going to be doing any Angular development on Salesforce, I think that's one of the first modules you should take a look at. So that's everything I have. Is there any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you said you weren't upgrading now. What do you think it would take to get you to upgrade, like the Ionic native or something like that? Or
well, yeah, I think
just people in general, it seems like it'd be a pretty major investment if they're continuing to backport everything. It's much easier to just I'm just going to add on this new feature versus having to switch over.
Yeah, I think what will get me to upgrade is kind of starting like a new type of like project from scratch. So if I'm doing something new mobile wise, I'm definitely going to look to start that. If your application is developed in kind of a proper like Angular structure and you're using different modules, it's actually really easy to kind of just, when you have a new feature that you're starting, creating a new module in Angular 2. If the structure isn't quite set up that way, it becomes a little bit messy because you can't break up all of your different components as nicely as you would want and kind of have part of your application in Angular 1, part of your application in Angular 2. And unfortunately, that's a little bit of the state of the application that I'm working with. It isn't as split up as it probably should be for something like this. But yeah, I see lots of really cool things in Angular 2, especially on the speed side of things. So like I said, I do have a small application that's maybe right now somewhere between like only like 300 and 500 lines of code. It's like a really small like front end piece. Right now, there's not anything on the roadmap to do anything with it, but that's something I'm like definitely looking at of if we're going to be doing anything with that application, it's going to be worthwhile to take the time to go through that upgrade process and become familiar with Angular 2.
How does I think it was called Angular Universal?
Yes.
Server-side piece. How would that play with like something like Salesforce?
Yeah, so that you'd have to implement like in Heroku. So you could have Angular Universal running in Heroku or in any other, server-based architecture. It's, a server piece. So I guess theoretically, if Salesforce gets on board with Angular, they could implement Angular Universal in Salesforce, but that's, I don't expect that to happen anytime soon.
That's not required to use Angular 2?
No, it's an extra add-on. It's just kind of a way of, it's a cool project that the Angular team came up with to kind of speed things up. And it's purely for performance because what it's doing is it's doing that initial render on the server side. You're only getting the information for that first page that you care about. And then after that page is rendered in the browser, it's pulling in the rest of the code for the rest of the application. So it's purely just a speed enhancement.
Okay, cool. So if you don't have that running, then how does it work? Just more like Angular 1?
Yes, like your traditional Angular 1, where when you go to the site, you load all your template files, you load all your services, all your controllers, the browser interprets the code, and then does any bootstrapping, calls out to your various services. Okay. With the addition of lazy module loading in Angular 2. So if you break up your modules, then only the particular module will load.
Okay, so even if you don't have the server-side component for whatever reason, there's still speed up?
Yes, with the lazy module loading, okay. Correct, yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you.
All right.